5. It remains to note the influence of Hume on Adam Smith's philosophy of science. In his youth, Smith evidently shared the usual interest of philosophers in the theory of knowledge. His essay on the external senses is just the kind of thing one would expect from an able young philosopher. Typically, and for this subject very properly, Smith brings together evidence from scientists and arguments from philosophers in order to reach his views. A prominent feature of the essay is his acknowledgement of indebtedness to Berkeley's new theory of vision, from which he is ready to accept much and to criticize a little. There is no reference to the more radical use that Berkeley made of the self-same arguments in the wider theory of his principles of human knowledge. Whether or not Smith ever read the latter work, he must surely have learned something of Berkeley's idealist philosophy from Hume's treatise of human nature. It therefore seems likely, as Dr. Whiteman suggests, 133 below, that the essay on the external senses is a very early piece, written before Smith had read Hume. If so, the history of astronomy will have come later. Although it does not mention Hume by name, it shows unmistakable signs of influence from the treatise of human nature. Apart from Humean language about the association of ideas and about degrees of vivacity in sensations, Smith's account of the imagination seems to be an adaptation of Hume. He does not simply follow Hume, however, as he largely followed Berkeley when writing of vision in the essay on the external senses. His view of the imagination in the history of astronomy adds a significant element of originality by applying to the hypothesis of science a notion which Hume had used to explain the beliefs of common sense. That is one point of historical interest in Smith's account of the imagination here. Another is that it shows Smith's appreciation of the positive side of Hume's epistemology. Scholars have tended to assume that Hume's contemporaries, like the thinkers of the 19th century, saw him as simply a skeptic in the theory of knowledge at any rate. This was certainly true of his most severe critics, Thomas Reid and James Beattie. Hume's constructive philosophy of human nature, brought out by such 20th century scholars as N. Kemp Smith and H. H. Bryce, was unperceived by Reid and Beattie, and so by the later critics who took their cue from Reid and Beattie. There is evidence, however, that some of Hume's contemporaries in Scotland, Adam Smith among them, did not share this blind spot. After Smith's death, his heir, David Douglas, evidently wrote to John Miller about the manuscripts which Smith had allowed to remain undestroyed. We know of this letter from the reply which it evoked. After referring to the essay on the imitative arts, Miller continues, "Of all his writings, I have most curiosity about the metaphysical work you mention. I should like to see his powers of illustration employed upon the true old Humean philosophy." The last words imply that Douglas, in his letter, had seen a connection between a work of Smith and the philosophy of Hume. They do not necessarily imply that Douglas would have agreed with Miller in regarding Hume's philosophy or the relevant part of Hume's philosophy as true, but they do at least suggest that he would not think the judgment novel or bizarre. The letter was printed by W. R. Scott in ASSP 311 and 13. Scott was not sure whether the metaphysical work of Adam Smith that is referred to could be identified. In a note, page 313, he said there was no trace of the manuscript so described, but in an earlier part of the book, he suggested that it might be either an unknown manuscript or the work entitled The Principles Which Lead and Direct Philosophical Inquiry that was printed in Smith's posthumous essays on philosophical subjects. There can be little doubt that this work is what Davis Douglas was talking about. Each of its 3 parts carries a title beginning The Principles Which Lead in Direct Philosophical Inquiries, illustrated by the term illustrated by is picked up in John Miller's phrase, I should like to see his powers of illustration employed. In fact, the metaphysical discussion on Humean lines occurs only at the beginning of the first and longest essay, The History of Astronomy, but the initial sections of that essay are intended to be a general introduction to the work as a whole. It is these introductory sections that Davis Douglas must have had in mind when he talked of a metaphysical work in the spirit of Hume. What, then, is particularly Humean about Adam Smith's view of the history of science and philosophy? Smith follows the dictum of Plato and Aristotle that philosophy begins in wonder, but he gives this a Humean twist. Wonder arises when the smooth course of the imagination is disturbed by an unusual sequence of events. It is a stretch to when philosophy, meaning science, shows the unusual event to be part of a system, a customary order, and so enables the imagination to resume an easy passage. Smith describes the work of the imagination in words that recall the doctrine of Hume's treatise. When two objects, however unlike, have often been observed to follow each other, and have constantly presented themselves to the senses in that order, they come to be so connected together in the fancy that the idea of the one seems, of its own accord, to call up and introduce that of the other. If the objects are still observed to succeed each other as before, this connection, or as it has been called, this association of their ideas, becomes stricter and stricter, and the habit of imagination to pass from the conception of the one to that of the other grows more and more riveted and confirmed. When objects succeed each other in the same train in which the ideas of the imagination have thus been accustomed to move, such objects appear all closely connected with one another, and the thought glides easily along them without effort and without interruption. There is no break, no stop, no gap, no interval. The ideas excited by so coherent a chain of things seem, as it were, to float through the mind of their own accord, without obliging it to exert itself or to make any effort in order to pass from one of them to another. But if this customary connection be interrupted, if one or more objects appear in an order quite different from that to which the imagination has been accustomed, and for which it is prepared, the contrary of all this happens. The imagination no longer feels the usual facility of passing from the event which goes before to that which comes after. The fancy is stopped and interrupted in that natural movement or career according to which it was proceeding. Those two events seem to stand at a distance from each other. It endeavors to bring them together, but they refuse to unite, and it feels, or imagines it feels, something like a gap or interval betwixt them. It endeavors to find out something which may fill up the gap, which, like a bridge, may so far at least unite those seemingly distant objects as to render the passage of the thought betwixt them smooth and natural and easy. The supposition of a chain of intermediate, though invisible, events which succeed each other in a train similar to that in which the imagination has been accustomed to move, and which link together those two disjointed appearances, is the only means by which the imagination can fill up this interval, is the only bridge which, if one may say so, can smooth its passage from the one object to the other. Smith is drawing here on Hume's account both of causation and of our belief in an external world. He writes not only of constant conjunction but also of coherence in our experience. When he describes the interruption of customary connections and of the smooth passage of the imagination, or the fancy, or the thought, and when he proceeds to say that the imagination fills up the gap by supposing a chain of intermediate, though invisible, events, he is making use of Hume's doctrine in treatise Livre 2, the section entitled Of Skepticism with Regard to the Senses. Smith is not simply taking over Hume's theory, for Hume deals with our belief in the continued existence of material things, while Smith talks about scientific theory. But Smith is adapting Hume's account of the imagination from the one subject to the other. Smith thinks that philosophy or science is an enlargement of common sense belief as represented by Hume. Philosophy, the science of the connecting principles of nature, may be regarded as one of those arts which address themselves to the imagination. Of course, Hume himself says that systems of philosophy are also a product of the imagination, but his description of the processes of the imagination in filling up gaps comes into his account of our ordinary belief in an external world, and that is what Adam Smith uses in his account of scientific theory. The Humean character of this section of Smith's History of Astronomy immediately strikes the modern scholar who is familiar with H. Bryce's book, Hume's Theory of the External World, 1940. It seems that David Douglas saw it in the same sort of way, and that his conception of Hume's philosophy included the role of the imagination in building up our beliefs about the world. There can be little doubt that Adam Smith himself appreciated this side of Hume. Although his debt to Hume is not explicitly acknowledged in the Astronomy, the phrases from the treatise are unmistakable. Smith takes seriously his conclusion that scientific theory is the work of the imagination. His History of Astronomy leads up to a detailed account of the theory of Newton. While Smith writes in more than one place of the attractions of the Newtonian system to the imagination, his description of it very naturally uses at times the language of objective fact. So he ends by recognizing that a work of imagination can seem to be the discovery of truth. And even we, while we have been endeavoring to represent all philosophical systems as mere inventions of the imagination, to connect together the otherwise disjointed and discordant phenomena of nature, have insensibly been drawn in to make us of language expressing the connecting principles of this one, as if they were the real chains which nature makes use of to bind together her several operations. Can we wonder, then, that it should have gained the general and complete approbation of mankind, and that it should now be considered, not as an attempt to connect in the imagination the phenomena of the heavens, but as the greatest discovery that ever was made by man, the discovery of an immense chain of the most important and sublime truths, all closely connected together by one capital fact, of the reality of which we have daily experience? Smith seems to be implying here that it is in fact a mistake, though a natural one, to think of Newton's system as the discovery of objective truths and to think of gravity as a real chain that binds operations in nature. This belief is an allusion to the imagination, to use a Humean phrase, binds operations in nature. This belief is an allusion to the imagination, to use a Humean phrase that Smith borrows in the theory of moral sentiments. Composed a little later than the History of Astronomy. The Moral Sentiments is much concerned with the role of the imagination in moral judgment, but there is one place where Smith also relates it to economics. This comes at the beginning of Part 4. Again, Smith builds on doctrine of Hume. Hume, he says, has explained the beauty of utility. The owner of a useful object receives aesthetic pleasure from it by being reminded of its convenience. The spectator receives similar pleasure by sympathy. We find the palaces of the great beautiful because we imagine the satisfaction we would get if we owned and used them. Smith then adds his own contribution that we often come to set a greater value on the convenient means than on the end which they were designed to promote. The poor man's son, whom heaven is in its anger has visited with ambitions, goes beyond admiration of palaces to envy. He labors all his life to outdo his competitors, only to find in the end that the rich are no happier than the poor in the things that really matter. And it is well that nature imposes on us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. The individual does not reap for himself the full benefit of his exertions. There is a benefit to society at large, but for the rich are led by an invisible hand to distribute much of their substance among the circle of retainers, and so, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society and afford means to the multiplication of the species. Smith has an ambivalent attitude to this deception by nature or the imagination. On the one hand, he says it is a deception. The ambition of the poor man's son is unfortunate, a visitation of the anger of heaven, and is succeeded in the end by the discovery that power and riches afford little satisfaction and are dangerous. On the other hand, this realization of the truth is a splenetic philosophy that comes to us only in the languor of disease and the rareness of old age. Ah non, c'était marrant, pas de problème. In a normal, healthy state, we let our imagination run away with us, and this is just as well because the deception is useful to society and mankind. At any rate, Smith is clear that it is a deception and that there is an alternative view which is true, though apparently less preferable. Would he say quite the same of Newton's scientific theory? He does imply that we are deceived in thinking the theory to be a discovery of truth and not just an invention of the imagination. But would he be ready to add that it is therefore false and that there is, or could be, an alternative theory which is true? Apparently not, for he puts all scientific theories in the same boat. Are there then no objective truths of astronomy to be discovered, or is the position rather that there are truths of nature but they cannot be discovered by man because he has to rely on his imagination? There is one important difference between Hume's view of the external world and Adam Smith's view of Newtonian mechanics. Hume began his discussion by distinguishing two questions. We may well ask what causes induce us to believe in the existence of body. But 'tis in vain to ask whether there be body or not. That is a point which we must take for granted in all our reasonings. Smith has endeavored to answer the Humean question, what causes induce us to believe in the existence of gravity? He would not, however, have added, but 'tis in vain to ask whether there be gravity or not. That is a point which we must take for granted in all our reasonings. Earlier theories of astronomy did not include a belief in gravity, and if anyone had suggested to Smith that a later theory might abandon Newton's concept of gravity and explain the observed facts in a different way, Smith would have agreed that this was quite impossible. So, although he is following Hume in the type of explanation that he gives, there is an important difference in their conclusions. In Smith's time, it was a bold thing to say that Newton's mechanics was an invention of the imagination rather than a discovery of truth, but it was far less bold than Hume's theory that belief in a continuing material world is due to fiction by the imagination. Since past systems of astronomy had done without gravity, one could conceive that future systems might dispense with it. There is no analogue in a history of different systems of ordering common experience. The belief in continuing material bodies has not been preceded by one or more different ways of interpreting sense experience, in consequence of which we could conceive of yet another interpretation becoming standard at some future time. When Smith writes that scientists have imagined inventions, he does not say that they have invented science fiction or any other sort of fiction. But he does contrast an invention by the imagination with the discovery of truth, and so he implies that scientific theory cannot be true. The constructions of scientific theory are like the constructions of perceptual belief in Hume's theory of the external world. J'ai pas tout compris. Donc, I like the construction of perceptual belief in Hume's theory of the external world because both are intended to render coherent the data of experience. But they are also unlike in that one scientific theory is succeeded by another. And today we should be more ready than Adam Smith to think that the replacement of the currently favored theory of physics or astronomy is not just possible, but probable. The replacement of one theory by another is not always in order to accommodate new empirical facts. The new facts could often be accommodated within a revised but more complicated version of the old theory. The new theory may be preferred because it is simpler or because it can be connected more directly with the theory of a related branch of science. If so, the criteria for preference are quasi-logical and aesthetic, like the criteria that shape the course of the imagination in Hume's theory of the external world. It is then proper to claim that the preferred theory is more is it then proper to claim that the preferred theory is more true than its rival? In these days of relativity theory, physics itself seems to cast doubt on any idea of strictly objective truths in nature independent of observers at different points of space and time. Adam Smith's view of science appears more perceptive today than it will have done in the 18th century. Ah, d'accord. The history of astronomy, the history of the ancient physics, and the history of the ancient logics and metaphysics. Introduction. Oui, c'est fini Descartes. Là, c'est Adam Smith. Après, ce sera Deleuze, avec différence et répétition. Et après, Saint-Augustin, avec la cité de Dieu. Très intéressant, Adam Smith. To the inquiring layman, Adam Smith was the author of The Wealth of Nations. To the philosopher of a comparable classic, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. These were the only books published in his lifetime. Within 5 years of his death, 1790, however, appeared under the editorship of his two friends, Joseph Black and James Hutton, a substantial volume entitled Essays on Philosophical Subjects, to which is prefixed an account of the life and writings of the author by Dugald Stewart. Though far less celebrated than the two major works, the EPS nevertheless appeared during the next 100 years in at last 8 editions, including one from revolutionary Paris and one from Basel. In the present century, the book has acquired a renewed interest, attention having been drawn principally to the first 3 essays, consideration of which has formed the basis of a significant secondary literature. The subject of each of these essays in the history of a branch of science, namely of astronomy, of the ancient physics, and of the ancient logics and metaphysics. Of these, the first alone is of any considerable length. The other 2 are hardly more than fragments. To none of them would a modern scholar turn for enlightenment on the history of the sciences. At most, he could expect to discover what an outstanding mind living in the second half of the 18th century believed to represent the history of these subjects. Wherein then lies the attraction to writers during recent decades? It lies in the full titles of the 3 essays, the principles which lead in direct philosophical inquiries, illustrated by the by the history of astronomy. The preamble is repeated before each of the other 2 histories. It might be conjectured from these that the first 3 essays are to be taken rather as chapters in a book than as separate pieces. That such a conjecture might be correct is supported by the advertisement of the editors, in which they emphasized that though immediately before his death Smith had destroyed many other manuscripts, he had left these in the hands of his friends to be disposed of as they thought proper, and that on inspection the greater number of them appeared to be parts of a plan he once had formed for giving a connected history of the liberal sciences and elegant arts, but that he had long since found it necessary to abandon that plan as far too extensive. Though there is now no trace of the manuscripts on which the collection was based, we know from other sources that this is hardly an adequate account. Ah mais, attendez, elle est longue l'intro. Ah ouais. Tant pis. Enfin, elle est longue, c'est une trentaine de pages, quoi. Bien. If the allegedly projected history was to embrace the elegant arts, why was the telling preamble to the first 3 essays omitted from the remainder? To the modern reader, it seems evident that whereas the former, inadequate though they may now appear, do conform to a unitary and highly significant plan, the remainder, though not without their interesting features, are neither treated historically nor do they illustrate the principles which lead in direct philosophical inquiry. The editors, though in other respects men of high eminence, were not noted for scholarship as such. We must turn to other sources to discover what part the composition of these essays played in the author's intellectual scheme of things. The Wealth of Nations. C'est là où il parle de la main invisible. Fortunately, we do not have to look beyond the volume itself. The essays were preceded by a long and detailed account of the life and writings of Adam Smith, read to the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1793 and subsequently published in their Transactions. The author was Douglas Stewart, professor of moral philosophy in the University of Edinburgh from 1785 to 1810, and the editor of the first collected works of Smith published in 1811 to 12. Towards the end of this account is cited Smith's earliest reference to the EPS of which we have any knowledge. It was contained in a letter to David Hume dated Edinburgh, the 16th, April 1773, when Smith was preparing to go to London, where he expected to remain some time. Exactement. In the expectation that Hume would, in the event of his own earlier death, act as his literary executor, Smith insisted that of all the papers he was about to leave behind, there are none worth the publishing but a fragment of a great work which contains a history of the astronomical systems that was successively in fashion down to the time of Descartes. Whether that might not be published as a fragment of an intended juvenile work, I leave entirely to your judgment, though I begin to suspect myself that there is more refinement than solidity in some parts of it. There is neither here nor anywhere else reference to other fragments such as the ancient physics and ancient logics that ultimately came to be published in the same volume as the astronomy. The possible significance of this omission will be discussed later. In 1773, Smith was already 50. It is unlikely, therefore, that he would have referred to any work as juvenile except such as had been written many years earlier. This supposition receives some support from his asking, why has the chemical philosophy in all ages crept along in obscurity and been so disregarded by the generality of mankind? How Smith could have formed such a judgment nearly a century after the prominence of Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke at the Royal Society, it is difficult to understand. But such an opinion would surely have been modified by intercourse with William Cullen, with whom Smith is known to have been on intimate terms after he assumed the Glasgow Chair of Logic in 1751. Ray in Life states that before the middle of November 1751, Smith and Cullen were already deeply immersed in quite a number of little schemes for the equipment of the College Glasgow. L'épreuve a lieu en anglais, enfin sur texte anglais. Donc il faut que je travaille sur le texte original et que je produise moi-même une traduction. Since by 1748, almost 2 years after relinquishing the Snell exhibition at Balliol College, Oxford, he must have been heavily engaged in the preparation and reading of his lectures on Belles Lettres at Edinburgh. It has been fairly generally assumed that he at least laid the foundation of the history of astronomy at Oxford. But from further internal evidence, it may be inferred that he did not finish it there. Towards the end of the astronomy, Smith wrote that the observations of astronomers at Lapland and Peru have fully confirmed Sir Isaac's system. Bogger's account of his observations in Peru confirming Newton's model of the figure of the Earth was published in 1749, 3 years after Smith left Balliol. The reader may have noticed a discrepancy between this reference to Sir Isaac Newton's system and, in the letter to David Hume, the description of the history as being of the astronomical systems that were successively in fashion down to the time of Descartes. The last 10 pages of the original printed text are in fact devoted to establishing the superior genius and sagacity of Sir Isaac Newton. Relevant to this question is the editor's terminal note. The author, at the end of this essay, left some notes and memorandums from which it appears that he considered this last part of his history of astronomy as imperfect and needing several additions. The editors, however, chose rather to publish than to suppress it. It must be viewed not as a history or account of Sir Isaac Newton's astronomy, but chiefly as an additional illustration of those principles in the human mind which Mr. Smith has pointed out to be the universal motives of philosophical researches. Mm. This is consistent with the view put forward above that though the astronomy may well have been largely composed in Oxford, the last part of it could have been added after Smith's return to Scotland. That even this last part was written before 1758 appears from this statement that Newton's followers have, from his principles, ventured even to predict the returns of several of them, particularly of one which is to make its appearance in 1758. We must wait for that time. Thus the text, a footnote on the same page, reads, "It must be observed that the whole of this essay was written previous to the date here mentioned, and that the return of the comet happened agreeably to the prediction." There is, in the original text, no indication as to who added this note, but P. Prévost, the translator of the French edition, describes the note as de l'éditeur anglais. Since Prévost was a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and claimed to be personally acquainted with Douglas Stewart, he may have had first-hand information. The apparent discrepancy in the letter to Hume disappears if it is recalled that Smith was expressing an opinion as to what of his literary remains might be worthy of publication. The notes and memorandums referred to in the editor's final note to the Astronomy suggest that Smith was more than doubtful as to whether the last part should qualify. The period 1746 to 8, when Smith was residing at Kirkcaldy with his mother and before he was committed to the reading of lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres at Edinburgh, would seem would seem as likely as any for laying the foundation of a project on the scale that he is known to have envisaged. Whether the other two fragments were composed during that period is a matter of no special consequence. There would, at any rate, be no inconsistency in his having spoken more than once, and presumably much later, to Douglas Stewart of having projected, in the earlier part of his life, a history of the other sciences on the same plan, and of his editors having referred to as a plan he had once formed, for giving a connected history of the liberal sciences and elegant arts. There were, of course, neither then nor for a long time afterwards any faculties of science in the Scottish universities, and the boundary between arts and sciences was hardly, if at all, clearly drawn. Logic and metaphysics are still mainly the concern of faculties of arts, as would also be the sort of ancient physics that Smith was describing in the essay so entitled. There is extant one another allusion by Smith, which, though somewhat inconsistent with those that have been referred to, cannot be ignored in any attempt to date the composition of the EPS. It occurs in a letter to the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, written from Edinburgh in November 1785, but not published until 1895. The relevant section runs as follows. I have likewise two other great works upon the anvil. The one is a sort of philosophical history of all the different branches of literature, of philosophy, poetry, and eloquence. The other is a sort of theory and history of law and government. The materials of both are in a great measure collected, and some parts of both is put into tolerable good order. But the indolence of old age, though I struggle violently against it, I feel coming fast upon me, and whether I shall ever be able to finish either is extremely uncertain. Now, whereas the description of the former of these other great works could well refer to the histories of astronomy, ancient physics, and logics and metaphysics included in the essays on philosophical subjects, the remaining essays, though falling under the generous heading of literature, philosophy, poetry, and eloquence, are almost wholly devoid of any reference to any historical development. Moreover, the limited range of topics hardly warrants the claim that the materials were in a great measure collected. In the fitful light of such evidence as is now available, it seems difficult to avoid the conclusion that after the exacting labor of the Wealth of Nations, with its successive revisions, Smith's great work on a sort of philosophical history existed more in the hope of realizing a youthful ambition than in any adequate progress towards its achievement. That Smith himself was far from being consistent in referring to his literary achievements and aims will appear in connection with the dating of the imitative arts. Fortunately, the impossibility of any precise dating of its components does not preclude further fruitful consideration of the part this ambition continued to play in Smith's intellectual development. In 1755, 4 years after Smith had been appointed to the Glasgow chair, he wrote the two well-known letters to the Edinburgh Review. In the second of these letters, Smith evidently considered himself so much a master of the state of the sciences in Europe as to include a critical review of the new French encyclopedia. And though the modern reader will detect a certain degree of superficiality, not to say even contradiction, in his judgments, he had clearly a wide-ranging knowledge relevant to the task. Among the contributors he refers to, many of them already known to foreign nations by the valuable works which they have published, he singles out Mr. D'Alembert and Mr. Diderot and refers to the former's famous Discours préliminaire. A perusal of D'Alembert's discourse reveals a strong resemblance to Smith's approach to the principles which lead in direct philosophical inquiries. In his stress on what he called Smith's theoretical or conjectural history, Douglas George expressed the view that the mathematical sciences, both pure and mixed, afford in many of their branches very favorable subjects for theoretical history, and he went on to note D'Alembert's recommendation of this historical approach for teaching. More striking still, he follows this reference by instancing a passage in Montuclat's Histoire des mathématiques, Paris 1758, which included long sections on mixed mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, optics, and their applications, where an attempt is made to exhibit the gradual progress of philosophical speculation from the first conclusions suggested by a general survey of the heavens to the doctrines of Copernicus. It is somewhat remarkable that the theoretical history of this very science was one of Mr. Smith's earliest compositions. Since George shared with Smith the habit of almost total lack of significant documentation, we do not know where he read D'Alembert's reference to Montuclat, but it obviously could not have been in the first edition of the Encyclopédie, 1751, which we know to have been in Smith's hands before 1755. Although we can beyond all reasonable doubt reject any charge of plagiarism, there is nevertheless one feature in Smith's appreciation of the Encyclopédie that must strike us as rather odd. In acclaiming the outstanding quality of D'Alembert's contributions, he makes no mention of the strong affinity between the latter's views on the nature, significance, and enlargement of philosophy and those we believe he had already set forth in the historical essays. Smith's review of the Encyclopédie was part of the evidence he submitted to the authors of the newly founded Edinburgh Review in support of the proposal that they should enlarge the scope of their review to include not only English but also European letters. It is not too much of some surprise that a young man, little more than 30, recently established as the leading philosophical teacher in a small but ancient university, should not in such circumstances have at least briefly impressed upon the review the universal significance of the Discours préliminaire. D'Alembert, though only 6 years older than Smith, was already accepted as one of the most brilliant analytical and comprehensive of European minds, a mathematician of the first rank who appreciated both the power of mathematics and its limitations as a mode for philosophy in general, and whose concern for this philosophy was primarily in its significance for human welfare. The broad agreement of the views of such an authority with this juvenile plan would, one might have supposed, have prompted Smith to a more enthusiastic welcome to the discourse than that Mr. D'Alembert gives an account of the connection of the different arts and sciences, their genealogy and filiation, as he calls it, which, a few alterations and corrections excepted, is nearly the same with that of my Lord Bacon. It is perhaps necessary to emphasize that the broad agreement in the views of Smith and D'Alembert was mainly, as noted above, in respect of their approach. A review of the details of their argument would here be out of place, but one especially marked difference in their emphasis may be the clue to the puzzle. It is that whereas Smith set so much store on wonder and surprise, D'Alembert, following Bacon, stresses the greater significance of need and use in discovery, a position that the author of The Wealth of Nations as dogmatically rejects. Could it have been that the juvenile author of the essays on philosophical subjects held his horses in the hope that an opportunity would later present itself for the systematic refutation of a theory whose wrong-headedness he evidently deplored? Though this account of the circumstances of time, place, and purpose of the composition of the EPS has been, if not wholly negative, at least mainly conjectural, it may have given some insight into the nature of the undertaking and the reason for its continued interest to scholars. Reference to D'Alembert's discourse has shown that Smith's attempt at conjectural history was not isolated phenomenon. Douglas George claims that the expression coincides pretty nearly in its meaning with that of natural history as employed by Mr. Hume, that is to say, the natural history of religion, and with what some French writers have called histoire raisonnée. Among examples of the latter, he names Montesquieu's Esprit des Lois. 1748. The title of that great work is itself indicative of what many writers were doing at that time. Paul Hazard reminds us of the numerous attempts to distill the esprit of this, that, and the other, frequently by means of a search for the origin and growth of the science or art concerned. The Encyclopédie was not the first to envisage this task. Something of the same sort had appeared in Ephraim Chambers' relatively concise Cyclopedia, or an Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences, 1728, but never before had it been accomplished in such a penetrating manner or on such an immense scale. The history of astronomy. The importance of this essay to modern scholars lies mainly in the preamble and the first three sections. These contain a statement and elaboration of the chief principles that Smith believed to lead and direct philosophical inquiries. The history of astronomy sensu stricto, that begins only in section 4, is of interest partly as an indication of contemporary knowledge of the subject, but mainly for the incidental remarks made by the author in pursuance of his central aim. Though acceptable to a modern historian in its main lines, it contains so many errors of detail and not a few serious omissions as to be no longer more than a museum specimen of its kind. This is not to deny its high merit for an age when systematic study of the history of the sciences was in its infancy. But by 1758, a student would have been better advised to read Jean-Étienne Montuclat's Histoire des Mathématiques, written incidentally in the enlightened spirit characteristic of the young Adam Smith, which by 1802 had been revised and extended by Jérôme de Lalande. The first history of astronomy, still used as an important work of reference, was completed by Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delambre in 1827. In any attempt to assess the success of Smith's enterprise, we are met at the outset by his inconsistent and ill-defined terminology. Philosophy is the science. Philosophy may be regarded as one of those arts. In fact, the terms philosophy, physics, arts, sciences, and natural philosophy are used almost indiscriminately. In this, of course, he was not alone. Hume, Treatise of Human Nature, Introduction, speaks of philosophy and the sciences, which seems to promise a distinction more in line with modern usage. But by including natural religion and criticism among the sciences, he introduced a possible source of confusion. The actual words natural science, in the sense of an inquiry by reason alone into all things in the natural kingdom of God, were first used by Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. But natural philosophy was preferred, though not in the restricted sense still current in the Scottish universities, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The first demarcation between science and art is attributed by the Oxford English Dictionary to Richard Kirwan. Previous to the year 1780, mineralogy, though tolerably understood as an art, could scarcely be termed a science. 1796. James Hutton, about the same time, wrote that philosophy must proceed in generalizing those truths which are the objects of particular sciences. In respect of the recent blossoming of the so-called social sciences, the failure of English to distinguish the species Naturwissenschaft from the genus Wissenschaft has become even more embarrassing than heretofore. Had Smith consistently used philosophy to include natural philosophy, leaving it to the context to indicate whether the general term or the specific application was concerned, there could, in relation to the period, be no quarrel. When he writes, philosophers, long before the days of Hipparchus, seem to have abandoned the study of nature and to have regarded all mathematicians, among whom they counted astronomers, with supercilious and ignorant contempt. His usage, whatever we may think of his judgment, was in general accord with ancient and medieval practice. In the Middle Ages, the interpretation of philosophy varied from one university to another. Roughly speaking, when the trivium was enlarged under the term Studia Humanitatis, and in many cases the quadrivium as such disappeared in practice, philosophy meant moral philosophy. Mathematics and astronomy, together with natural philosophy, more often called physics, became mainly the concern of the faculty of medicine. This was especially the case in the Italian universities. But Smith's judgment cited above follows a brief account of the epicyclic and eccentric systems of planetary motion by which those philosophers imagined they could account for the apparently unequal velocities of all those bodies. Who are those philosophers? It was, we are told, Apollonius who invented the system and Hipparchus who afterwards perfected it. Apollonius was a mathematician of the caliber of Eudoxus and Euclid. Hipparchus pioneered the branch of mathematics that came long afterwards to be known as spherical trigonometry, and he was also among the greatest observers of all time. Most of the astronomical works of each were irretrievably lost. But to neither is any interest in philosophy attributed, a fact at which Smith himself hints in another context, where he speaks of the philosophy of Aristotle and the astronomy of Hipparchus. The precise distinction made by the Greeks themselves will be cited in the introduction to the essay on the ancient physics. It would of course be absurd to demand precisely demarcated categories which would only stifle attempts to reveal latent relationships. But that in relation to the age of Adam Smith there are traps easily fallen into is shown by a recent comment, Thomson, Adam Smith's Philosophy of Science, that Smith referred to Isaac Newton as a philosopher, not scientist. From Smith's use of the term in this context, nothing can be inferred, since the word scientist did not exist before 1839. The use of such expression as Adam Smith's philosophy of science may similarly be a source of confusion. Better to risk a charge of repetitiveness and pedantry than that of circularity. Each reference must be explicated on its own merits. J'arrive. This caveat has an indirect bearing on the introductory sections of the astronomy. Smith's aim in this and the succeeding essays was to show how these histories illustrate the principles which lead and direct philosophical inquiries. Having in the first 3 paragraphs given the barest hint of the relevance of surprise and wonder to these principles, he reviews at what may seem inordinate length the influence of the sentiments of surprise and wonder on the emotions of joy, grief, panic, frenzy, etc. The modern reader, especially one unfamiliar with the pervasive significance accorded to the passions by Smith and his contemporaries, may feel puzzled to know what all this had to do with the clearly expressed aim of the essays. Smith might have been wise to recall Bacon's words that such observations are well inquired and collected in metaphysic, but in physic they are impertinent advancement of learning. But after a dozen pages, the rhetorical fog lifts, The surprise excited in the observer by the motion of a piece of iron without any visible impulse, in consequence of the motion of a lodestone at some little distance from it, and the wonder how it came to be conjoined to an event with which, according to the ordinary train of things, he could have so little suspected it to have any connection, established the thesis in the clearest possible manner. The further deployment of the thesis, even if unnecessarily prolonged, displays Smith's elegant and imaginative style at its best. Had he but said his own words, philosophy is the science of the connecting principles of nature at the beginning instead of near the end, and then avoided the trap in the ill-defined term philosophy, this section might well have ranked as the most fundamental in the whole work. Though not free from confusion, the concluding pages of this section reveal in greater emphasis Smith's principles of philosophical inquiries. Central among these is an interpretation of causal investigation as a search for a bridge. The examples here are much more convincing. The special characteristics of this bridge or chain are analogy to more familiar objects, coherence, and of special significance for the modern scholar, without regarding their absurdity or probability, their agreement or inconsistency with truth and reality. This remarkable passage is our justification for caution in speaking about what has been called Smith's philosophy of science. For Smith himself, who, as we have seen, defines philosophy as the science of the connecting principles of nature, the term could have no clear connotation, nor could it for anyone until the term science was restricted to what Smith is here calling philosophy. There is still no general agreement as to the range of the philosophy of science, but that it is essentially meta-science, or talk about science, would probably not be contested. Of this there could not in Smith's time be any explicit recognition. No doubt the study of these enterprises will shed light on the nature of the problems to be talked about, but in respect of its systems his inquiry was less about their truth than about how far each of them was fitted to soothe the imagination, and to render the theatre of nature a more coherent, and therefore a more magnificent spectacle, than otherwise it would have appeared to be. This has certainly a modern ring about it. But a modern philosophy of science that thus ignored the problem of truth would get rather a cold reception. It is thus less the philosophy of science than the history of the idea of the philosophy of science that Smith's enterprise is likely to illuminate. For a further elaboration, see the present writer's Adam Smith and the History of Ideas in Essays on Adam Smith. The essay was designed to be read in conjunction with this introduction. The dubious historiography and scrappy exposition of Section 3 of the Origin of Philosophy are characteristic of the Age of Reason. Imaginative liveliness creates a colorful stage upon which the drama of Western culture is to take its rise. Regrettably, imagination, on Smith's attitude to the faculty of imagination, see below, 12. Regrettably, imagination, aided and abetted but not controlled by reason, takes command, and what was in the circumstances inevitably no more than a likely story is presented with a degree of naive dogmatism and assurance that would be beguiling if it had not engendered distorted attitudes in the long shadows of which we are still living. The danger of conjectural history is thus made only too plain. Justification of this rather critical assessment may most suitably wait on textual commentary. In section 4, we are plunged rather abruptly into the history of astronomy proper. Abruptly, since Smith has already stated that it is from Plato and Aristotle that he will begin to give her history in any detail. The highly complex and mathematically beautiful system of Eudoxus is thus made to appear fully formed like Pallas from the head of Zeus. For his purpose, Smith is perhaps justified in thus proceeding, but not to emphasize the extreme unlikelihood of such a creation without a long preparation of accurate observation and critical correlation is to risk begging the whole question of the genesis of philosophical inquiry. Once launched, however, of the exposition of the first regular system of astronomy, he moves, not indeed with complete mastery, but with a remarkable degree of precision and understanding. Since among the readers of this edition there may be some wholly unfamiliar with the rationale of this system, it may be as well to give a necessarily somewhat simplified, but also more concise account of it than Smith provides. To facilitate cross-reference, this will be set out in a somewhat schematic schematic form. The celestial phenomena appearances were either relatively transitory matters or eternal. Comets remaining visible for months were the subject of some controversy. Difficile à dire. En littérature ou en philosophie? En littérature, c'est Proust. Juste après, Film de l'assassin d'Amélie Nothomb. Et en philo, c'est Bergson. Tout Bergson. Et Jankélévitch. J'aime beaucoup Quelque part dans l'inachevé de Jankélévitch. C'est un livre d'entretien avec Béatrice Berlovitz. The eternal bodies, with 7 notable exceptions, were fixed in space relative to each other. The exceptions, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, to give them their Latinized names, were all called planets or wandering stars, since their positions varied continuously both with respect to each other and to the pattern of the fixed stars. All the visible objects were seen to move in circles round the Earth in a time constituting a day. The various minor discrepancies among the planets were accounted for by assuming additional circular motions superimposed upon the uniform daily rotation. The fixed stars were thus regarded as being carried round by the rotation of the celestial sphere whose axis, since many of them periodically rose in the east and set in the west, was held to be variously inclined to the surface of the earth. Contrary to the belief still held in some quarters, the flat earth had been generally abandoned about a century earlier, and, though reintroduced to conform to biblical cosmology, was probably never again seriously considered among men having any pretension to astronomical knowledge. D'accord. Juste, je regarde ce que c'est. Since the sun and moon are seen to make a circuit of the stellar sphere once in roughly what? Look, in roughly 365 and 29 days respectively, the motion of each was regarded as being compounded of that of the stellar sphere and that of the second sphere whose axis was inclined to that of the stellar. In the case of the sun, the equator of the second sphere was called the ecliptic, and the lattice obliquity represents the observed progressive changes in the sun's altitude in the course of the year. A third sphere had to be added to account for a further minor irregularity in the observed motion. The moon's observed motion resisted any adequate representation. It was one of the few problems that gave Newton a headache 2,000 years later. The motions of the remaining planets were partially accounted for by supposing them to share the daily and approximate annual motion of the sun's 2 spheres. The third was peculiar to the sun. But these 5 bodies, and very obviously those that were believed to be always further from the earth than is the sun, possessed a characteristic irregularity of apparently coming to a halt, and then roughly retracing their path to a second point before once more proceeding in the general direction. These meaningless stations and retrogradations of each of these planets was saved by the ingenious device of fixing each planet on a sphere, the poles of whose axis were also fixed on the surface of the surrounding sphere to whose axis their axes were inclined. And at the same time supposing them to rotate in the opposite sense, each had a characteristic rate different from that of the surrounding sphere. The process could be repeated, and the inclinations and relative rates of rotation varied, to give the closest possible approximation to the appearances. All this is set out by Smith with only relatively minor historical inaccuracies, but he does not here make clear that the constant and equable motions reported by reliable commentators to have been demanded by Plato were in fact an uniform angular motion in perfectly circular paths. Nor, though he has his own view as to the human urge to seek coherence and a continuous chain in natural phenomena, does he comment on Plato's postulates in flat opposition to the evidence of the senses, except in respect of the daily revolution. Plato discussed these questions in several dialogues. In his final vision of the cosmos, if he did in fact ever arrive at one, is still a matter of controversy. But his guiding principle, from which he made no fundamental departure, was that the visible heavens have the same relation to things divine as they really exist as do geometrical figures to those truths of reason that they are made to represent. In proceeding from the concentric systems of Eudoxus to the eccentric and epicyclic systems that permanently superseded it among the Greeks, Smith missed 2 points of fundamental importance to his principles that lead in direct philosophical investigation. The first was that Aristotle's edition of 22 spheres had nothing to do with the inefficiency of the spheres to represent the motions. The reason was what we should call a philosophical demand for physical coherence. The additional spheres were so intercalated as to prevent the characteristic motion of each of the planets from being transmitted to the remainder. Another serious physical discrepancy, apparently first observed by Autolycus of Pitan, but not by Aristotle, was the fact that no system of spheres concentric with the Earth could conceivably account for the marked changes in the apparent size of, e.g., Mars and Venus, implying variation in their distances from the Earth. The contrast between astronomy and physics sketched by Aristotle, well known to the Middle Ages and Renaissance through the commentaries of Simplicius, but apparently lost sight of later until stressed by Paul Duhem in his, will be discussed more at large in the introduction to the Ancient Physics. The first step towards the epicyclic and incidentally towards the Copernican theory of planetary motion was taken by Heraclides of Pontus, who, noting the fact that neither Mercury nor Venus is ever seen far from the Sun, as the latter makes its annual circuit of the heavens, put forward the hypothesis that the circular paths of the former bodies were centered at the Sun, not the Earth. A century later, when Alexandria had replaced Athens at the center of Greek culture, this hypothesis was extended by Aristarchus of Samos to include all the planets, of which he regarded the Earth instead of the Sun to be one. This revolutionary hypothesis, in which the diurnal rotation of the Earth, already assumed by Heraclides, was also adopted, was summarily rejected by his contemporaries. Nevertheless, since their imaginative leaps achieved the essential basis of that of Copernicus, the omission by Smith of any mention of these two men is quite unaccountable. Sorry. Though no motion of the Earth was acceptable to astronomers until the time of Copernicus, and even then but tardily the concept of epicyclic motion, that is to say the circular motion of a body about another body itself describing a circle about a third, rapidly achieved a dominating influence and received a definitive form in the Almagest of Ptolemy. Strapped down to the barest essentials, this system was based on the following postulates. 1. The Earth is the center of the world. 2. The Sun moves at a uniform rate on a circle, the eccentric, whose center is somewhat distant from the Earth. 3. The remaining planets, except the Moon, move on circles, epicycles, whose centers move on larger circles, difference, centered at the eccentric. But the planets themselves are represented as moving at a uniform rate round a separate point, equant, on the side of the eccentric remote from the Earth. 4. The Moon's motion is especially anomalous. The eccentric and epicycle had been elaborated by early astronomers, notably Hipparchus, but the equant point, concerned not with the shape but with the rate of planetary movement, was the creation of Ptolemy himself. Since their concern was to provide a mathematical model for forecasting celestial events, the Alexandrian Hellenistic astronomers took no account of the existence of spheres. The later Islamic astronomers, strongly influenced by Aristotelian and later physics, devised means of harmonizing epicyclic and eccentric motion with the concentric celestial spheres. This mode of thought achieved its ultimate refinement in the theory of George Purbach. The so-called Copernican revolution was in fact a retrogression to ancient principles buttressed by superior mathematical technique and the less parochial worldview characteristic of the Renaissance. Far from being technically modern, the system of Copernicus was in some respects retrograde in the pejorative sense. This judgment does not detract from the dedication and intellectual courage of the man himself. By one of those paradoxes that the history of science displays from time to time, Tycho Brahe, the great restorer of the science of the heavens, as Smith describes him, spent his life and fortune, aided by royal patronage on a lavish scale, in assembling the data enabling Johannes Kepler to demolish both his own extension of the system of Heraclides and the details of the Copernican system. Tycho's model, postulating a heliocentric system of all the planets, the Sun and Moon alone describing circles about the Earth, was mathematically equivalent to that of Copernicus, at the same time avoiding any affront to the physical prejudices of the age, still predominantly Aristotelian. Endowed with a spirit in which intense religious feeling, high poetic fancy, and unswerving intellectual integrity were combined to a degree probably unsurpassed in any man before or since, Kepler made the first and final break with the Platonic postulates of equable circular motion for celestial bodies. It is the Sun, not the Earth, around which the planets describe the only discoverable simple curve, not a circle but an ellipse. And it is the Sun that determines, in a degree corresponding to the harmonics of the diatonic scale, the speed with which they move in the paths appointed by God. Stripped of the overtones that Kepler himself regarded as his supreme act of praise to the living God, his three laws, really four, the first, the demonstration of the planet's orbits, including the Earth's, are coplanar with the Sun is unaccountably omitted from the textbooks. Kepler himself never set out the laws in any systematic form. Laws are the basis of the modern astronomy of the scholar system. Within the limits of the available knowledge, Smith's account of the revolution in astronomical thought effected by Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, and Kepler displays remarkable understanding. There is, however, one misleading feature in his exposition, the statements that the Copernican system has no need of epicycles. It is indeed true that each of these statements is made in the context of the apparent shape of the planetary motions, but not many paragraphs later it is made clear that in order to rid his system of the incoherence of the equant point, Copernicus had in fact been compelled to employ a number of epicycles. One of Kepler's earliest discoveries was that the motion of the Earth demanded just such an equant point. It is of course a mathematical dot to represent the hitherto unthinkable fact that the planets move faster when near the Sun than when more remote. Smith's account is further notable for having stressed the possibly decisive nature of Galileo's telescopic observations. The rough surface of the Moon, the satellites of Jupiter, sunspots, and the phases of Venus, all phenomena that could appeal to a wide audience, thus enlisting a wider support for the Copernican hypothesis than Copernicus's own dry mathematical exposition would have done. Smith has claimed that the latter was adopted by astronomers only, though qualified on the next page, gives a misleading impression of the situation. This and some relatively minor points are more conveniently dealt with in footnotes to the text. Bizarre. Ah, Uh, Diane. I mean, the confused state of astronomy during the first half of the 17th century was just such as to give point to Smith's principle that discovery is the fruit of a search of a connecting chain of intermediate objects to link together. Discordant qualities, in this case, the immensity of the celestial bodies and the hardly conceivable speeds with which they are hurled round the sun. The gap left in the imagination by a purely mathematical model, however subtle and however accurately representative of the facts, received expression in the full title of Kepler's Astronomia Nova. The physical, or if you will, metaphysical element in his system was supplied by a supposed magnetic radiation emitted by the sun as it rotated, thus maintaining the revolution of the planets at varying speeds. That doctrine, wrote Smith, like almost all those of the philosophy in fashion during his time, bestowed a name upon this invisible chain, called it an immaterial virtue, but afforded no determinate idea of what was its nature. In an age dominated by Newton's proper rejection of occult causes such as reaction was inevitable. But it is not the whole story. Kepler's magnetic virtue was more than a name. In fact, magnetism was not, in the distinction made by Newton, an occult but a manifest quality. The fact that it is a different manifest quality, gravitation, that was later shown to be the controlling factor between sun and planets does not detract from Kepler's recognition that a chain must exist. In his second letter to Richard Bentley, Newton emphasized that the cause of gravity is what I do not pretend to know. Smith and his clear-sighted contemporaries failed to realize that the greatest creative advances in the search for this invisible chain have seldom been free from the wildest guesses. The first who attempted to ascertain precisely wherein this invisible chain consisted, and to afford the imagination a train of intermediate events, was, Smith justly states, Descartes. The details of the Cartesian system fortunately do not concern us, but Smith shows remarkable sagacity in emphasizing that it was he, and not, as is still occasionally stated, Galileo, who stated three propositions that jointly imply Newton's first law of motion: that his notion of God's conservation of the quantity of motion in the universe made a notable advance towards Newton's second law, and that he was among the first of the moderns who took away the boundaries of the universe. Not surprisingly, Smith nowhere shows any knowledge of the wide-ranging mathematical speculation of the 15th century Cardinal Nicholas of Cues, whom Kepler called divine, nor of the limited publication of Thomas Digges' theory of stellar distribution in depth. But his omission of any reference to the ill-supported but widely publicized plurality of worlds affirmed by Giordano Bruno is less easy to excuse. His lengthy treatment of Descartes in A History of Astronomy, Smith claims, is justified less by his theory of the heavens, that by the time Smith was writing was almost entirely abandoned, than by his demonstration that a coherent system of the world could be based on simple mechanical principles applicable to both celestial and terrestrial bodies. This was a radical departure from the natural philosophy still dominant in the schools. Samuel Pepys was so vexed to discover that his younger brother John's knowledge of physics was based on Descartes instead of Aristotle that he decided to find out what it is that he has studied since he's going to the university. So far as physics were concerned, both Samuel and John were wasting their time, for in the same year a young Caesar of Trinity College in the same University of Cambridge was also giving less than satisfaction in his undergraduate studies. But within 3 years he was to think of extended gravity to the orb of the moon. Cambridge was slow to appreciate the tremendous revolution that the young Lucasian professor of mathematics proceeded to hatch within its walls. But a few years after its publication, 1687, under the imprimatur of Samuel Pepys, PRS, the elements of Newton's Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica were being introduced to the students of the University of Edinburgh by David Gregory. Despite the lack of any break in the narrative, it seems most probable that it was at this point that Smith's original manuscript ended and the remainder was added at some later date. About Smith's account of the Newtonian system, which, despite his doubts, stands least in need of correction at the present day, little need be said. It is clearly written and includes all the verifications available by the middle of the 18th century. It is doubtful whether he had ever studied the Principia at that time. Voltaire's Éléments de la philosophie de Newton had been published in London by 1737, and if this section was in fact written some years after the rest of the essay, Colin Maclaurin's account of Sir Isaac Newton's philosophical discoveries would have been available to him after 1748. Of course, he may have been sufficiently well grounded in the qualitative aspects before leaving Glasgow. The only disconcerting feature of this account, taken as a contribution to the principles of philosophical investigation, is the facile manner in which he accepts gravitation as an adequate explanation of the mutually determined motions of the celestial bodies, simply on the grounds that it has always been familiar to men on the earth. Taken in conjunction with his remarks in hailing Descartes as having been the first to attempt to ascertain precisely wherein this invisible chain consisted, this must be regarded as a serious deficiency. It betrays a strange lack of awareness of the fact that what he saw as so familiar a principle of connection, which completely removed all the difficulties the imagination had hitherto felt in attending to them, many continental philosophers, notably Leibniz, regarded as either a miracle or a blasphemy. The root of their objections was that celestial gravitation, unlike the familiar form, must be held to act instantaneously across immense distances. Moreover, since the planets showed no sign of slowing down as a result of external resistance, there could be no material medium to transmit the gravitational influence. Such an action at a distance must be regarded as either an inexplicable miracle or an occult property of matter itself. Neither solution was acceptable. Not the former, since it removes the question entirely from the realm of natural philosophy, nor the latter, since it reintroduced the specific occult qualities postulated by the Aristotelians, which, as Newton himself later remarked, put a stop to the improvement of natural philosophy. This fundamental dilemma, and much else of a more technical nature, was ventilated in the famous Leibniz-Clark correspondence first published in 1707. Newton, on whose behalf, and at the instigation of Princess Caroline, Clark replied to Leibniz, showed his recognition of the difficulties by adding to the second edition of the Principia, 1713, the famous general scholium containing the even more famous and misunderstood phrase hypothesis non fingo, and by his letters to the Master of Trinity, Richard Bentley, in one of which he explicitly denied that gravity is essential and inherent to matter. Newton was fully aware of the lack of finality in his system of the world and returned to the question several times. But since Smith was apparently unaware of this, it would be inappropriate to enter into the inevitably long and difficult discussion here. The history of the ancient physics and the history of the ancient logics and metaphysics. The history of astronomy, though naturally imperfect, was in a sense complete. After the second edition of Newton's Principia, there was no fundamental change or addition to the system of the world. That was Smith's main concern until long after his death. The mathematical theory was under constant refinement, and Smith shows his continuing interest in the progress of physical astronomy when in the Edinburgh Review article he refers to James Bartley's important discovery of the aberration of light. But the titles of the two subsequent essays suggest that the restriction to the ancient period expressed the fact that he had said all that he intended to say. The two essays now to be considered, though like that on the history of astronomy, both written with an eye to philosophical investigation, are in a different class from the first. Je viens de recevoir votre message et c'est très touchant, merci beaucoup. Euh, ouais. Look, the two essays now to be considered, though like that on the history of astronomy, both written with an eye to philosophical investigation, the title of which reveals a subtle change of aim. The histories of these sciences are to be restricted to their ancient development. For these and other reasons that will appear during the discussion, it is convenient to introduce them under a single heading. To a greater extent than in the history of astronomy, his account of the facts of pre-Socratic physics is not only without adequate historical foundation, but lacks any historical coherence other than that imposed by Smith's own likely story, namely that from arranging and methodizing the system of the heavens, philosophy descended to the consideration of the inferior parts of nature. There neither is, nor ever was, as far as we know, any evidence for this order of inquiry. On the contrary, Aristotle rightly referred to his predecessors as those who strove to account for nature, which for them was the whole cosmos. Their speculations about the objects above the earth in fact lacked any arrangement or methodizing. They remained crude and ill supported by reason. The views on the elements, Aristotle calls them, on the other hand, put forward separately by the Ionian pioneers, embodied a profound insight into the problem of the relation between change and the permanent ground of being. Only later did the Italian Empedocles order the elements in such a manner as to make possible the even later square of opposite properties introduced by Aristotle. As has been hinted already, Smith never made explicit the cardinal distinction between physics and astronomy, a distinction that in fact guided and directed philosophical inquiry from Aristotle onwards, and which, in somewhat altered terms, is still a living issue in the philosophy of science, notably in the interpretation of quantum mechanics. The basic formulation has never been more clearly put than by the 6th century Neoplatonist Simplicius in his commentary on Aristotle's Physics, and in which he claims to be quoting the actual words of Geminus summarizing the views of the Stoic Poseidonius, both of them having lived much nearer to the time of Aristotle. After a long and detailed preamble, he emphasized that while the physicist will in many cases reach the cause by looking to creative force, it is no part of the business of the astronomer to know what is by nature suited to a position of rest and what sort of bodies are apt to move, but he introduces hypotheses under which some bodies remain fixed while others move, and then considers to which hypothesis the phenomena actually observed in the heaven will correspond. The astronomer, in other words, is satisfied if, given certain physical postulates, such as equable motion, he can devise a mathematical scheme from which the motions of the heavenly bodies can be deduced. The question of truth has for him, qua astronomer, no relevance. In the history of astronomy, notably in the introductory section 2, Smith shows his appreciation of this aspect of philosophical investigation. But this failure to his failure to explicate the notion of cause, latent in the various pre-Socratic speculations and dominating Aristotle's whole philosophy, reduces his ancient physics, despite its elegant and persuasive presentation of certain aspects, to a much lower level of cogency. Detailed justification for this judgment would here be out of place. Suffice it to say that the reader of the text will find no hint of the pervasive notion of final causation and the grades of animation, the Latin anima replaced in the transmission of the Aristotelian corpus in living beings. Having momentarily forgotten his most promising hypothesis that philosophical inquiries stem from surprise and wonder, Smith opens the essay on the history of the ancient logics and metaphysics with liberal application of the term evident to assumptions that to thinkers in another tradition seem far from evident. These apart, however, he rightly insists that philosophy in considering the general nature of water, takes no notice of those particularities which are peculiar to this water, but confines itself to those things which are common to all water, from which it follows that species, or universals, and not individuals, are the objects of philosophy. In the succeeding passage, amounting to little more than 20 lines, Smith condenses all that he has to say on the relation between the ancient sciences of logic and metaphysics. Restricted to such a compass, his account of what came to be regarded as logic and metaphysics might do well enough, though the exclusive emphasis on classification is hardly warranted. But viewed as a stage in the achievement of his historical aim, it is quite inadequate. In claiming with some justice that these two sciences seem, before the time of Aristotle, to have been regarded as one end, with less justice to have made up between them that ancient dialectic of which we hear so much and of which we understand so little, Smith gives no hint that and its derivatives covered a huge range of meaning as much to do with words as with reasoning, nor that the term metaphysics came only long after Aristotle's death to refer to those of his books, which embodied a consideration of those causes and principles the knowledge of which constitutes wisdom. First philosophy as Aristotle himself described it. The throwaway comment on the ancient dialectic may have been prompted by Smith's native caution. The subtle and even inconsistent use of the term by Plato and Aristotle is still the subject of scholarly debate. The inappropriateness of the remark becomes even more remarkable in the light of the following definition proposed by the stranger from Ilia. Dividing according to kinds, not taking the same form for a difference or a different one for the same, is not that the business of the science of dialectic? Plato, Sophist. This division by kinds is precisely the method that Smith himself regarded as being the essence of the ancient logics, and one of which he himself makes frequent use. This account of dialectic differs from the more basic requirement stipulated by Socrates, that is to say, the effort to attain truth by correction of agreed hypotheses rather than the confutation on an adversary, but is not inconsistent with it. Equally regrettable is Smith's failure to make clear, as Aristotle had, that the pre-Socratic, as Aristotle calls them, were asking metaphysical questions, but for the most part, Parmenides being clearly an exception, giving physical answers. The part of the essay devoted to an exposition of Plato's attitude to nature and its relation to the general theory of ideas, though disproportionately long, is almost the only part that carries conviction that the author had adequately prepared himself for the ambitious task he had undertaken. But even here he fails to drive home the lesson, so important for his own thesis, that what Plato was for the most part concerned with, even in the dialogue that looks like natural philosophy, the Timaeus, is perhaps not even metaphysics, but rather natural theology as it was perhaps understood in the original scheme for the Gifford lectures. This was far from being without influence on the development of natural philosophy and subsequently of the natural sciences. But by placing cause and principle of nature as it were out with nature and providing only a likely story of how it might have operated, Plato effectively closed the door on further investigation on the lines initiated by the. Or rather, we would have closed it, had not his independent minded pupil, Aristotle, put his foot in the doorway, at least for the sublunary world. At this stage, some readers may reasonably protest that it is an editor's function at most to comment on the text and not to argue with its author. To leave without qualification the rather disparaging remarks which this editor has felt it necessary to make would amount to a failure to view the matter in that historical perspective, for the lack of which Smith has been censured. Well versed in the classical tongues, as the young Adam Smith undoubtedly was, he cannot be blamed for having failed to transcend the limitations set by the materials available to him. And these were meagre indeed, for though we may think of the 18th century as one in which classical scholarship was most highly appreciated, and familiarity with the classical authors more widely spread than perhaps at any other time, it is apt to be forgotten that both scholarship and familiarity were almost wholly restricted to grammatical and stylistic aspects. It is probable that Smith's contemporaries were far less conversant with the matter of the Greek classics than had been the humanists of 3 centuries earlier. In his valuable Greek studies in England, 1700 to 1008, 1945, which in fact includes a knowledge chapter on Scotland, M.L. Clark states that the undergraduates at Oxford and Cambridge read only a few isolated dialogues of Plato and learned nothing of his philosophical theories. Before 1759 there was no English translation, except of the Phaedo, to which the Scottish scholar Spence added the Republic only in 1763. Aristotle was in like case. Smith's dismissal of the Ionian on the ground that the extant accounts represent the doctrines of those sages as full of the most inextricable confusion is of a piece with Clarke's judgments that of the remarkable speculations of the pre-Socratics there was no appreciation. He would have had to rely upon Aristotle's biased views put forward in the Metaphysics. In respect of logics, he was presumably the victim of the trivialization of Aristotle's logic, unavoidable if it was to be taught to the lower end of the teenage stream. His point of view, putting objects into the right classes, seems to be based on the topics, even perhaps mediated through Ramism, but of the structure of inference as expounded by Aristotle himself in the two Analytics he gives no hint. If this conditioning was effected at Glasgow, it would not have been unique. It is only in our time, by John Lukasiewicz and others, that the modernity of Aristotle's canon has been made generally known. Smith was also unlucky in setting forth on this immensely ambitious endeavor at a time when Giambattista Vico's principles of critical historiography based on critical philology were still wholly unappreciated outside Italy. Nevertheless, when all allowance has been made for the handicaps under which Smith must have labored when composing these juvenile historical pieces, there remains an air of brashness about the two, presumably later ones, that provokes the question whether the author of the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations would have countenanced their publication in the form in which he had left them. It is true that as late as November 1785, in the letter to Rochefoucauld referred to above, the sort of philosophical history he mentions as still being upon the anvil must have been at least based on the great work mentioned in the letter to Hume 12 years earlier. But in that letter he expressly stated that none of his papers were worth publishing except a fragment, The History of the Astronomical Systems, and even that one he suspected contained more refinement than solidity. How much more apposite would this judgment be of the two subsequent essays, in view of his repeated request, as he neared his end, for assurance that his papers had been destroyed? It seems more than a little doubtful whether his editors were not doing his memory a disservice in making public these two essays without a more extensive caveat than the rather fulsome and misleading last sentence of their advertisement. End of the introduction. Bibliographical note. The survey on which this note has been based was restricted to the following institutions: British Library, National Library of Scotland, Cambridge University, Trinity College, Dublin, and the four Scottish universities existing before the recent expansion: St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Edinburgh. 8 editions prior to 1900 have been established, at least one copy of each having been examined. Only NLS has a copy of every edition, 2 of these being accessions from the library of Lauriston Castle near Edinburgh. Thanks are due to members of the library staff at NLS, C, SCA, and D for information about their holdings. The full title page of the first edition is provided together with brief descriptions of the remaining editions. 1 sample collations have been carried out. No substantial differences in the texts have been discovered. Dublin, some spelling mistakes have been corrected. Mr. Pollard of Trinity College Library states that the copy of this edition was purchased only in 1962. It contains the bookplate of Ellis, Anne Levinge with the signature. Mr. Pollard emphasizes that reprint by Dublin printers was perfectly legal, provided that the books were not offered for sale in England. 3. Essai philosophique par feu Adam Smith, docteur en droit de la Société royale de Londres, de celle d'Édimbourg, etc., précédé d'un écrit de sa vie et de ses écrits par Dougal Stewart de la Société royale d'Édimbourg, traduit de l'anglais par le professeur Prévost, professeur de philosophie à Genève de l'Académie de Berlin, de la Société des curieux de la nature et de la Société royale d'Édimbourg. Première partie à Paris, imprimeur libre. fine portrait bust of Adam Smith, opposite title page. Of this, in some respects, the most adequate edition, a rather full description seems to be justified. It is unique among editions before 1900 in containing Adam Smith's long letter to the Edinburgh Review, here in French translation, numerous notes of varying length by the translator, and mainly relating to the later essays, also a fairly detailed table of contents of the whole, the second party of which is separately signed and paged. The notes are described, presumably by the publisher, as très intéressantes. Of special interest is the translator's statement that the note on Halley's comet is de l'éditeur anglais. 4. The late Adam Smith, to which is affixed an account of the life and writings of the author by Douglas Stewart. Basil, printed for the editor of the collection of English classics sold by James Decker. The only point of interest in this edition is the omission of any reference to the original editors, Joseph Black and James Hutton. 5, edited by Giles Stewart and dated 1811, also contains the essay entitled Considerations Concerning the First Formation of Languages. New edition. This apparently very rare edition was printed by Allardyce, Leith for Allardyce, Edinburgh, Griffin, Glasgow, and several London houses. The copy examined is inscribed and stamped on the Union of King's and Marischal Colleges, previously separate universities. The volume is in fact a reprint of both TMS and EPS. Biographical notice is drastically abridged. Essays philosophical and literary stated in BL catalogue to be a duplicate. The essays are included in the early writings of Adam Smith, edited by J.R. Lindgren. This edition includes the Edinburgh Review articles, the preface to William Hamilton's poems on several occasions, and the languages. It is not introduced or annotated. Note on the text. The present volume follows the text of the first edition, published by Cadell and Davies in 1795, 5 years after Smith's death, but with print errors corrected. Since the essay is designed to illustrate the principles which lead and direct philosophical inquiries rather than to provide a history of astronomy per se, no attempt has been made to achieve that completeness of documentation which would be appropriate in a definitive classic. The principles which lead and direct philosophical inquiries, illustrated by the history of astronomy. Advertisement by the editors. The much lamented author of these essays left them in the hands of his friends to be disposed of as they thought proper, having immediately before his death destroyed many of them. A greater number of them appeared to be parts of a plan he once had formed for giving a connected history of the liberal sciences and elegant arts. It is long since he found it necessary to abandon that plan as far too extensive, and these parts of it lay beside him neglected until his death. His friends are persuaded, however, that the reader will find in them that happy connection, that full and accurate expression, and that clear illustration which are conspicuous in the rest of his works, and that though it is difficult to add much to the great fame he's so justly acquired by his other writings, these will be read with satisfaction and pleasure. Joseph Black and James Hutton. Et donc, the history of astronomy, je dirais ça plus tard. Peut-être, ouais, on verra. À toutes.